When the Great War ended in November 1918, it set in motion a train of events that reshaped the world. Leaning toward isolationism, the United States turned inward. With surprise and shock, one event changed everything. One man wrote in his diary that Pearl Harbor ended isolationism for any realist. His name was Arthur Vandenberg, a former newspaper publisher who became a United States senator almost by accident. He called himself the luckiest man alive, the very model of a senator with white hair and an owlish look. He was described by one journalist as the pouter pigeon with the Kewpie smile. This is the story of America's capacity for change and how one politician became a statesman as he helped shape the world by defining America's new role in it.
And so begins the story of Senator Arthur H. Vandenberg in this remarkable documentary titled America's Senator, The Unexpected Odyssey of Arthur Vandenberg. Joining me for an in-depth look at the impact this man from Grand Rapids had on the United States and the world during his time in office is the documentary's executive producer, Hank Meyer, and from Grand Valley State University, Gleaves Whitney, who heads up the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. This is truly a remarkable documentary for anybody who has been in downtown Grand Rapids, walked by a certain statue, and saying, who is this man? This documentary, I think, sums it up from beginning to end. Hank Meyer, you have a tremendous interest in Vandenberg. Where did this come from?
It might be a hometown passion in part, but I think he's arguably the most important American public figure of the 20th century for whom there is no biography. And so that was a life waiting to be told, and I couldn't resist.
And you've been writing this biography for some time now.
For an embarrassingly long time, yes.
How long now?
20 years.
It's not an easy story to tell. I mean, there are so many details involved here from a national and a global perspective, Gleaves. What is the impact? I mean, if you had the 15 seconds to tell somebody about this man, what do you tell them?
Well, let me take a little bit more than 15 seconds. The idea here is that you can look through biography to tell a great story about the big events, the big history of the 20th century, the formative period for the world in which we live today. And by having a master storyteller and somebody who's so diligent in his research on Vandenberg's life, I think you see it come together in this film in a way that's accessible to people to see what it was like to be a senator during the Great Depression, what it was like to be a senator, you know, on the eve of our entry into World War II. Europe is already a conflagration, but then we get into it in Pearl Harbor, and you have to manage this change in public opinion. And Vandenberg is the architect at every step of the way in managing how this public opinion is going to change and steering America toward world responsibility away from a position of isolation.
And let's take a look at those big picture moments that he is such a pivotal part of. The isolationism, that all changes during the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There's a shift here. Why don't we pick up the story there and we can work our way around it. But that's really one of the things that is most well known about Arthur Vandenberg.
Like so many Americans who lived through the First World War, that had been undertaken by the U.S. with high hopes, with Woodrow Wilson talking about a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And what happened after that? Millions of people died, thousands of Americans died, and along came Nazism, fascism, communism. 20 years later, those European countries are ready to go to war again. They go to war again, and most Americans, including Arthur Vandenberg, said, we don't want to have anything to do with it. So we want to isolate or insulate ourselves from these wars that are happening across the ocean. Pearl Harbor, of course, changed that, changed the perspective of many Americans, and forced Arthur Vandenberg to rethink what America's role in the world should be.
Politicians don't always like change? This is a major shift. What is it about that event and the events taking place around the world that truly wake him up, I guess, to changing the position of the United States?
You could no longer ignore that the oceans were no longer moats. I mean, with the United States being dragged into this war, in some ways kicking and screaming, nevertheless, dragged we were, and we had to respond on a two-front war. This was a major world event, and of course, World War II would end up being the most horrific war in human history, 60 million deaths. The United States had to get in there and play a major role in this, and it's to Vandenberg's credit, as it was to people on the other side of the aisle, that they were able to manage their political differences enough to forge a bipartisan agreement, which I think forms a paradigm for us today.
And let's talk about that a little bit, because these paradigms live on. What are we seeing here from that time?
Well, the ability to say, look, politics stops at the water's edge. When we craft a foreign policy, we have to speak not as Republicans and Democrats, but as Americans. Vandenberg, it's to his credit and to the other leaders at that time, they were able to overcome a lot of political and personal differences. There was personal animus that Hank can go into. He's got some of the great stories, the personal animus between Vandenberg and FDR, say. And now Vandenberg had a better relationship with Truman. Truman had been a senator. They knew each other. But to overcome that personal animus for the sake of the country was an ideal model, a paradigm, I think, for politicians and potential statesmen today who are looking at truly some significant foreign policy challenges, and they've got to kind of get away from their partisan stances on some of these things.
Because he really does advance the United States. If you look at the history since those moments, I mean, we're looking at NATO is created. We're looking at there's a League of Nations. I mean, take me through all of those new programs that Vandenberg sets in motion that sets up a greater foreign policy for this country that we appreciate today.
Well, the United States emerged from World War II as the lone superpower. The other countries had all been devastated by war. And we had been a superpower before the war, but we hadn't acted like one. And now came the challenge of assuming world leadership. And what did that mean? That meant, from Franklin Roosevelt's standpoint and from Arthur Vandenberg's and a lot of others, trying to create a United Nations. Let's start talking as global powers instead of going to war next time. That hadn't worked after World War I. Roosevelt was astute enough to say, I need Arthur Vandenberg as the leading Republican voice on foreign policy to be part of that American team putting together the United Nations. So he went to San Francisco in 1945, helped write the UN Charter, was probably the strongest, most influential American delegate there, and came back with his credibility coming from an isolationist background to say, this is where we as a people need to go, and sold it very easily to the United States Senate. Well then, a year later, George Marshall comes back from Europe. He had been General of the Army and become Secretary of State, and the European nations were absolutely devastated by World War II. Countries that had been democracies, France, Britain, the Netherlands, needed help or they would be threatened. Italy, by communist subversion, by internal dissension, they were impoverished. He proposed this massive aid program that people on Capitol Hill, congressmen and senators, blanched at and said, we can't ship all this money to Europe. Vandenberg said, now wait a minute, let's understand what the needs are, what the impact on the American economy is. He was chairing the Foreign Relations Committee at that point. Very patiently put together a package that adapted what Marshall envisioned to what the American people and the Congress would accept, and we got the Marshall Plan. Then Vandenberg said, you know, when we were putting together the UN, we created the ability to have regional security arrangements. We could have the countries of the Americas band together to protect one another. Maybe we should apply that logic to the European countries. Let's have something that he called the Vandenberg Resolution that he typed out on his portable typewriter in his little Washington apartment. That laid the groundwork for NATO. and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the first entangling alliance that the isolationists used to be terrified of, was created by Arthur Vandenberg and sold again to the Senate.
It's easy to forget how much hostility there was even to the Marshall Plan. It was called Operation Rat Hole because they thought it would just be a money sink, a money pit that would not necessarily. I remember Gore Vidal in the great interview, Hank, that you had with him in Hollywood, where Gore Vidal said, "Oh, well, the Marshall Plan was just for the bankers. The bankers were just going to skim off the top, and maybe a few of the dollars would eventually get to the little people in Europe." So there was a lot of hostility toward them, but Vandenberg persisted. He had the vision. He was the architect of this great Cold War institutional arrangement that allowed us to stay basically at peace for the next decades.
Well, I think Vandenberg and President Truman both understood that for these monumental undertakings, committing the United States to the United Nations, committing American treasure to the Marshall Plan, committing us to a military alliance with these European countries that so recently had been at war with one another, these needed the consensus, the buy-in of the American people. You couldn't do it by one party slamming it through Congress. You needed to do it by consensus. And I think there again is a relevance for today. We have parties jockeying for power, but ultimately the decisions they make and the major programs they adopt are not going to succeed if it's one party ramming it through the other. If it's 50% of the American people imposing it on the other 50%, you've got to get some bipartisan buy-in, and that was part of the magic of Arthur Vandenberg.
When you look at that history, and we talk about the arc of history, you know, Cleves, correct me if I'm wrong, you're like a 50-year arc where you get a chance to truly look back. Is that what this documentary represents, that opportunity to look back? Because you were talking about, you know, the Marshall Plan, it's a rat hole. Now you have a chance to look back at it and say, yes, that worked, or no, it didn't work. It worked. And is that what this documentary is about, that this man from Grand Rapids truly made enormous impacts to the world as we see it today?
It really is a twin impact that I think that this documentary has. The way it's crafted, the way it's based on Hank's book, the documentary does a great job in showing a lesson in history. One of the most challenging moments in American history, our existential relationship to the world was at stake. We were in real danger in the late 30s and 40s. And at the same time, it's a great picture into what we've become. Vandenberg and his generation succeed in guiding us through the crises of the 30s and 40s. They lay the groundwork through their vision of the post-war world, which we all benefited from around this table, and provide a model today and in the future for what statesmen in America should act like. We have models. This is not a mystery. And I think the disinterestedness of an Arthur Vandenberg and a Harry Truman, when it counted, provide that paradigm that we're desperately in search for today.
You talk about the times, Great Depression, World War II. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. Franklin Roosevelt and his nemesis is Arthur Vandenberg. As you watch the documentary, you start to see this confrontation building. Take me back and the viewers back to what was taking place at the time and what triggered this.
Well, when Franklin Roosevelt took office in the depth of the Depression, the American people were hungry for action, and he provided it with legislation of all sorts, trying to turn around the economy, bringing a lot more power to the federal government in the hopes that policy could restore prosperity. One of the issues that Arthur Vandenberg believed in most firmly was protecting small investors in banks, because there had been runs on banks. People were pulling their deposits out. They couldn't trust the banking system. So he proposed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure bank accounts for small investors. FDR hated that thought. This was going to protect the banks, and that was not his goal. And yet Vandenberg had so much support in Congress that the bill passed in spite of Roosevelt, and later Roosevelt was delighted to claim credit for having overseen this legislation that was one of his proudest achievements. So I think that riled Vandenberg a little bit. But these efforts to turn around the Depression, to restore prosperity, didn't work very well. And so you had Republicans who were continually challenging this growth of federal power. And Vandenberg was one of the best at tackling every piece of excessive spending or every pet project of the president's. And one of the wonderful little things we learned in the course of our interviews was our own Ralph Hauenstein, when he was city editor of the Grand Rapids Herald, becoming friends with the first FBI agent who established an office in Grand Rapids in the late 1930s. It turns out, as Ralph learned, that that agent was sent here by J. Edgar Hoover in large part to keep an eye on Arthur Vandenberg and understand his background, because Roosevelt figured that in 1940, Vandenberg was his most likely and most formidable opponent. Now, war broke out in Europe and changed that, but that was the dynamic that existed at the time.
Well, and the party was a big supporter of Vandenberg once these successes started to accumulate.
Mm-hmm. When Vandenberg's interest in the presidency seemed to be surfacing, or people were certainly starting to shower him with some attention, I just want to add that one of Ralph Hauenstein's proudest moments is when the FBI agent came to him and he said, "Ralph, let me go into the morgue of the Grand Rapids Herald and get anything you've got in there about Vandenberg." And Ralph stood up to that FBI agent, that G-man, and he said, "No way, you're not going to get anything out of our morgue."
Yeah, you better have the paperwork, right, if we're going to make this happen. His personality, to understand where that comes from, tell us a little bit about the man himself. Obviously did very well here in Grand Rapids, self-made millionaire, but the personality, who is Arthur Vandenberg?
He was a pretty crusty character. I mean, he was rather full of himself. He had been writing editorials in the Grand Rapids Herald. Now, you have to remember at the time, Warren Harding was an editor in Marion, Ohio, when Vandenberg, in his late 20s, early 30s, was an editor and publisher in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the much bigger city. And he was writing speeches for Warren Harding when he became president, influencing American policy from his desk on Fulton across from Veterans Park. He thought he was pretty hot stuff. And in fact, he was acclaimed as a rather gifted orator. He was clearly very bright. He's writing editorials that are getting reprinted nationally at a time when newspapers were the dominant medium.
And wrote some music, right? Some sheet music.
Yes, and writing short stories on the side. So he didn't suffer fools gladly. Young reporters found him pretty intimidating, but older reporters became his confidants because he loved the press. And so he could be arrogant and impatient, but he was also intensely honest. He set high standards for other people and for himself, and his ego was something that diplomats could play with a little bit, but ultimately it also did not get in his way from making the right decisions.
I have to add to that wonderful description of him, you can see it, as you saw in the documentary, you can see his own personal style in giving speeches, which does tend to be a little bit more expressive, maybe bombastic compared to today. But it depends on the perspective. I think one of the most interesting interviews that Hank had was with Gore Vidal, and a point came where Hank was asking the same kind of questions, what was he like personally, and Vidal said, well, if you flattered him enough, he would be the flower boy at your wedding. I mean, clearly this was a huge man who elicited very strong responses, pro and again, depending on your point of view.
And being that orator, and you mentioned bombastic, television wasn't around back then, so you had to make your voice known on the spot to large crowds. The speech heard around the world. What is the theme there? What point is he making?
This is in January of 1945. The Allies are winning the war against Germany. The end of the Third Reich is months away. Roosevelt is about to travel to Yalta in Russia to meet with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. They're going to set the plans there for the United Nations and for some of the post-war relations between the victorious Allies. Roosevelt hasn't shared with anybody in Congress and with very few people in the State Department what he's thinking and what he's going to achieve. Vandenberg doesn't want him leaving for Russia without hearing from Arthur Vandenberg. So he stands up in the Senate and does two things. He reverses his many years of avoiding entangling alliances with other countries by proposing a treaty among the Allies to keep Germany demilitarized. He's challenging the Russians because he's saying, we'll join with you to make sure the Germans are no longer a threat to you. So you can't use that as an excuse to occupy Poland, to control all the Eastern European countries. He is trying to buck up Roosevelt and tell him what to do. He's also standing up to and challenging the Russians in a way that they hadn't been challenged before because they'd been our allies during the war, and we're pretending like we're one great cooperative, victorious team when already tensions are starting to set in. He's putting the world on notice with that speech.
And his view of communism at the time is what?
He was strongly anti-communist. He opposed the recognition of the Soviet Union back in the 1920s and was deeply suspicious. Roosevelt and even later Truman had rather famously said they thought they could work with Stalin. And Vandenberg had great suspicions of whether that was possible. And he was very vigilant in his anti-communism.
In fact, to put legs on the Truman Doctrine, which proclaimed that we would give aid to people who were fighting the communists, Turkey, Greece, wherever, Vandenberg had that famous, and I think somewhat apocryphal line, Hank, that to get Congress to fund this, you got to scare hell out of the American people. So Vandenberg was right there in the vanguard of anti-communism.
What do we see with, you say, scare the American public? Were there signs of that early on? I mean, granted, you give this speech, but was there then a movement to make the American public aware of, well, I mean, we all know as we look at history, but did you begin to see that shortly after?
Well, and then of course you'd see it in the extreme right wing of the Republican Party with Joe McCarthy, McCarthyism. So you could see a lot of discontent, fear-mongering in some cases that was coming to the surface.
Post-World War II, his legacy, what takes place? He moves into what? You were talking about the poster child to run for president. That doesn't happen. He moves into what area?
He moves into a sphere that was almost post-partisan. This guy was a rabid Republican all his life. But he really reaches a point in 1946 when he becomes chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of saying, I'm dealing with issues here that are bigger than what my old party instincts would have told me. I'm in a unique position here as the leading Republican in the realm of foreign policy to work with the Democrats. They need me because we've got a majority in Congress, but we need to work with them to make sure we're on the same page in building a strong American role in the world. We're not going to be there if we're feuding within our parties.
And he stays in politics for how long?
Not long after that, he discovers in 1949 that there is a cancerous tumor in his left lung. He knows of that in the summer of '49. He puts off doing anything about it until September of 1949 for one reason, because NATO, which had been approved the year before, had not yet had money appropriated to rebuild the European armies. He felt strongly that had to happen. He spent the summer of 1949 lobbying his colleagues and even testifying before the House of Representatives, we've got to put teeth in NATO. September of 1949, he comes back to Ann Arbor, has part of his lung removed. He's in and out of the hospital for the next year and a half before he dies in 1951. So he had this sort of brief, glorious period of tremendous influence from 1945 to 1949.
All right. Hank Meyer, executive producer of American Senator, and Cleves Whitney, director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.